Morning. The Lord is inviting us to come. The questions are, how do we come and what do we say? There was a woman at St. Rita Church that would come to daily Mass. I think Mass was there at 7 a.m. One morning she approached and she was burdened by whatever was in her heart. And so she and I sat in the sacristy on the bench there, and then she talked about what she was holding on to. And then there was a cross on the table there, so I invited her to take the cross and hold on to the cross. And then she began to weep. And she cried and she cried and she cried. I have no idea what brought her to the church that morning. What brings us to the church this morning? The Lord is inviting us to come, to be here. He says, "Come and learn from me." In the French translation, this phrase is rendered, "Put yourself in my school." Put yourself in my school. Now, the purpose of going to school, or the purpose of learning, is to grow, is to become better people, the best version of ourselves. On Thursday, we read from the book of Genesis, and it started like this. It said, God put Abraham to the test. Do you ever feel like God has put you to the test? And isn't the purpose of the test to pass? And oftentimes in our life, as we go through these trials, we feel defeated or we feel discouraged. And that's where Jesus is inviting us from, we could say, struggle to surrender. From those things that don't make sense to us to surrender. There's a book that I read some years ago. It's called Life Lessons from the School of Suffering. And it's a story of a priest, 49 years old, who's diagnosed with renal cell kidney cancer. The tumor is the size of a football and weighs 10 pounds. When he's told of this, that it's metastasized to the lungs, that really there's nothing that they can do for him, this is what he says: "Dear Lord, I place my life in your hands." He travels that journey from struggle to surrender. It's really the journey that we're all invited to. So maybe 2 life lessons as we think about this journey. The first is, God is asking us to be faithful. There's that wonderful story said of Mother Teresa. She's approached by a reporter, and he says to her, "Don't you feel like a failure?" And she says, "What do you mean?" And he says, "For the one person that gets to die in your arms, what about the countless of others who die unloved and uncared for?" And she responds by saying, "God did not ask me to be successful, God asked me to be faithful." And in the midst of our own suffering, in the midst of those things that don't make sense, how are we called to be faithful? There's the series, The Chosen. I think it's maybe on season 3. And there's the first woman, the first person that Jesus encounters is Mary Magdalene. And there's that real human tension that she faces. There's that struggle. And I love this series because it gives us an idea of what Jesus might have encountered in his earthly ministry with people who are just as human as you and I. And there's this real conflict that Mary Magdalene has, that Jesus is inviting her from her struggle to a place of surrender. The other one that I find quite fascinating is the person of Matthew. We could say that Matthew might be on the spectrum. And Jesus invites him. And there's this great, again, this conflict that Matthew has. He's trying to figure it out in his mind. Is this the one? Is Jesus the one? Perhaps we find ourselves like Mary Magdalene or like Matthew. Maybe we're conflicted today. I had dinner with some friends in the city on Friday evening. There were 2 doctors, 2 flight attendants, a pharmacist, and a priest. Isn't that a great start for a joke? I think one of them is a former Catholic, one of them is a practicing Catholic, 2 of them are non-Catholic. One of them says, "Father, why is Christianity so hard?" Good question, isn't it? Scripture says they know that we are Christians by the way that we love each other, by the way that we take care of each other. So the second lesson that Jesus wants to impress upon us today is that we're not meant to do it alone. Is that we journey to the kingdom together. And that's a hard myth to get over, isn't it? Because we live pretty independent lives, don't we? 20 years ago, I got a phone call that I never want to get from my sister who said, my mom has just had a heart attack. And they're flying her to the Heart Institute, and they're going to do open heart surgery. And remember, they did. The surgery was successful. But the day after, they got her up and started walking her. And the most difficult thing for my mom was to accept help. Because she's very independent. Reared 7 kids, lots of grandkids, and she knows what she's doing, right? Moms, they're superpowers. And yet it was so hard for her to let us help her. Sometimes we're like that, aren't we? And yet the good news is reminding us that we do it together, that we help each other on the way. So perhaps the bit of encouragement today is to reach out to that person you know is suffering. You know that person who is struggling. And oftentimes we don't because we don't know what to say or we don't know how to act. It is St. Teresa who says, let God use our hands and our hearts and our eyes and our feet to share the good news. So imagine if each of us did that here in New Lenox at St. Jude, or Frankfurt, or Mokina, or Manhattan, or Will County, affecting change in the way that we choose to live our life. So the Lord is inviting us to come from struggle to surrender. The invitation for us as we receive Holy Communion this day, as we are receptive, as we are open to give the Lord whatever it is we're struggling with. And in turn, we receive the living God so that we go forth and share the good news.